Hi there. I'm Debbie Gamble, and on behalf of the whole team at Interact, I want to welcome you to the Identity North Summit and to this discussion about the state of digital ID in Canada. For all of us in the digital identity space, the pandemic has clearly accelerated and amplified the need for digital ID, whether interacting with others online, accessing government services, or performing high-value transactions virtually. The importance of being able to safely and securely assert our identity digitally has never been greater. At Interact, we believe digital identity is a key component that will unlock greater value across our society. And when done right, it can serve as a bedrock for an inclusive digital economy that is a source of opportunity and prosperity for all. To get there, we will require a collaborative effort between the public and private sectors. And this will involve building and leveraging trusted platforms which give Canadians confidence their information and data will be secure. Our team at Interact would love to talk to you more about how we can build this future together. A number of us will be at Identity North, and you can swing by our virtual booth to say hi. If you see me or any of my Interact colleagues at the virtual social event, please do introduce yourself and have a wonderful time at Identity North.
I'm joined today by my friends Neil Butters and Joni Brennan. And the purpose of this session here is to talk to you a little bit about identity and get you set up for Identity North. We run Identity North a few times a year, and every year we have a lot of people joining on for the very first time. Sometimes in person when we're able to do that, and often this last year and a half we've been doing these virtually. The point is that we want to make sure that Identity North is super accessible and that there are no barriers and that people don't kind of say, oh, I can't participate in Identity North because I don't know enough of the background. And so we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we thought what we'd do is gather around a couple of experts, people a lot more knowledgeable than myself, and try to give a little bit of an on-ramp to the digital identity ecosystem and some of the things that you're going to hear about. So that you'll feel really comfortable to participate and come out and bring your voice to the room. So without any further ado, maybe actually, Neil, can you just quickly introduce yourself, and that way everyone knows kind of where you're coming from?
Great. Thanks, Aaron. My name is Neil Butters, and I'm heading up the Digital ID Initiative at Interact.
Awesome. And Joni?
Hi, everyone. I'm Joni Brennan, President of the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada, or the DIAC for short.
Awesome. So what is ID and what is digital ID? Let's kind of start with the basics here. So most of us use our ID every day throughout our lives, right? We carry proof of our identity in the very front of our wallets in the little window, often in the form of a driver's license. But those don't really prove who we are. They only prove that someone that looked like us with a particular name on a certain date was given permission to drive. And these certificates that we carry around are actually reasonably hard to fake, so we use them as a proxy for proving who we are in person. That's our physical credential, and that's who we use to prove who we are within a reasonable doubt, as they say. When I looked back at how I got my driver's license, I was pretty surprised to see that it all came back to my passport, and that actually required me to have a birth certificate. Joni, what does that mean? What's the ultimate root credential, or if we go back to the headwaters of identity, where did we come from?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Thanks for asking, Aaron. And when I try to explain digital identity, sometimes I call it a bag of attributes. It's a bag of things that say something about you with a certain degree of certainty attached to them. If we're talking about the legal instantiation for identity from a legal identity perspective in Canada, then there are two places that can come from. That can come from the provinces, which is why you might be asked to produce your birth certificate. Or that can come from the federal government if you're born in the province, or that can come from the federal government if you're not born in Canada, in which case you have a permanent resident card, and that's the equivalent of your Canadian birth certificate. Now, you might notice right away that there's quite a difference between a birth certificate and a permanent resident card. They're quite different kinds of credentials. And so, for example, a permanent resident card has a picture on it, but your birth certificate doesn't, and you certainly will be growing over time. And so I think that when we think about how we build an identity, how an identity is built, we should really think about it again as that bag of collection of statements about you. And so that can be birth certificates, that can be permanent resident cards, but can also be other types of data and other types of credentials that you collect along the way that you're able to present for different kinds of transactions that you're trying to perform.
So if I can extrapolate from that, there's kind of formal identity or identification, which is kind of issued by the government. And then there's the identity we can construct out of kind of metadata about us that might be some of it given to us, some of it that we assert or that we say about ourselves. I can say that my hair is kind of black, but you all know by looking, if you look really closely, that it's got a fair amount of gray in there. So there are some things that we are kind of are said about us and other things that we might say about ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable and accurate, Aaron. Identity is very contextual, and yes, it's things that you say about yourself or that others claim about you. And so which pieces of identity you should be showing or who the authority is really depends on who's asking the question.
All right, so that's a great way to kind of bring in Interac here. Neil, I mean, you guys deal with, a lot of how many transactions are you guys dealing with on a daily basis? Can you say that?
Yeah, it's about 16 million times a day Canadians use the Interac services.
And I'm guessing it has to be pretty reliable.
Yeah, it has to be very reliable. Yeah, and one of the great things about Interac is, being the number one most trusted financial services brand in Canada, we have to bring quality services in order to maintain, that kind of recognition, right? So, yeah. And
so you guys are pretty good at making sure that, the money comes out of the right account at the right time and kind of verifying that someone, that's using an account has permission to do that. And I'm thinking that when we talk about digital ID, in some ways, we're kind of talking about how would we kind of make a digital version of a driver's license or a birth certificate in kind of the same kind of reliable way that you stream and may push through kind of 16 million transactions a day.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the payment systems have done an excellent job over the years of showing how we can go from paper money to digital money. And be able to transact safely. And we believe at Interac that there needs to exist a similar adjacent system for identity, because identity is used in order to get your bank account in the first place. So if we raise the bar around providing digital services to open your bank account, then we're actually reducing fraud and creating a better ecosystem that's safer, secure, more secure, and more privacy enabling.
Okay, so Interac decide? I know the answer to this, but maybe for the benefit of those joining from home, literally, so who set the rules for Interac about how transactions and who can participate in the network?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So it's a mix. Interac is a regulated company by the federal government, and we're a prominent payment systems, governed by the Bank of Canada. So there are certain rules that Interac must follow, but at the same time we have our own rules, our own governance framework that we institute to make sure that the parties that are participating on the network are following the rules and to make sure that it's safe and secure, and have the ability to remove bad actors when we need to. So that governance framework is very important. and it's not just Interac, it's the federal government's and Payments Canada and Interac that sets those rules.
So I'm looking for the analogy or the analogous system and set of governance for identity. Joni, is there a set of APIs to connect to yet for all the different provinces that someone could get permission to kind of start writing to and start using that?
No, I'd say we're not there yet, Aaron. There certainly is a lot of work that's been happening, and I'll be clear that I'm not speaking on behalf of many governments here, but there certainly is a lot of work that's happening across Canada in the provinces with the federal government on establishing mechanisms for Canadians to be able to access public sector underwritten data and to be able to enable Canadians to present that data in different situations that they would like in a way that respects privacy and doesn't create a tracking or a surveillance system. So there are definite movements within the provinces and with the Fed with regard to this kind of ecosystem. Yet it is a journey, and we are a federation, and so the provinces are at different places and the federal government is in different places and the departments are in different places in terms of what they are doing. This said, there is a pan-Canadian trust framework that sets guidance for rules and tools on how the public sector entities and the private sector entities all should be working together across different technologies to give Canadians this enablement with access to data so that they can use that data to perform the transactions that they need. So we're on the road for sure.
Okay, so I'm going to keep going with this analogy around payments because not every payment system is the same. Not every payment terminal, or POS terminal, point of sale terminal, not every handheld device is the same. Not every bank machine is made by the same company or the same device, but they're all interoperable. Likewise, you would expect that not every province or territories or the federal government immigration are going to use the exact same technology, but they'll be interoperable. And in the same way that the banks all had to find ways of issuing a digital credential instead of just having the old bank books, and they had to have a digital credential, there's ultimately going to need to be a need to transition the old kind of equivalent of the old paper birth certificates into a digital form of a credential so that we can use those on the internet and for paying things or using for transacting digitally, just like we've had to kind of transition the payments infrastructure. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's obviously there's definite challenges in making sure that a government issued identity gets into the right hands, and while it is in transit, is secured and gets into the right hands. But I would agree with the analogy that the payment systems have provided a good use case, albeit it's not an exact footprint or blueprint for the way it should be in the future. But yeah, I think the payment systems have done a good job of kind of directing the way of how things can unfold. And this, we have to remember, this is all about utility and the ability to provide services to the end users, the citizens. And it's going to take both the public and private sector in order to get there. Governments have a tendency to issue credentials for their native purposes, which is great. But at the same token, we're using those credentials as normal citizens in the private sector. And in order to deliver these services securely, we need to take into account that there's a bridging function that needs to happen in order to make this safe, secure, and privacy enabling.
All right. I think that's a great way to kind of segue into utility and uses. So the pandemic has really put a spotlight on how we need to be able to use digital version of identity, to be able to transact securely right from the convenience of our own homes, and to be able to do all the things that we used to do, except maybe getting on planes. So, Joni, what are some of the use cases for digital identity for me as a person, maybe?
Yeah, and I think this is a great question, first of all, and also what I'll say is Actually, none of these use cases are new. These are use cases that have been here, and the pandemic has only served to further create more urgency and demonstrate why we need to move on solving the digital identity piece of the puzzle. But in terms of those use cases, if we think about it, in order to it's important to have the ability, Neil talked about getting the credentials into the right hands. And so the right hands could be my hands as a resident. The right hands could be the hands of a doctor or a nurse or so the right hands could be, we could look at that through different lenses. Where the some real world use cases of today, and I think the one is very topical, would be around proof of vaccination. There's certainly a lot of work to be done on proof of vaccination, and a lot of that work is policy driven, governance driven versus technology driven. So let's say we need some real policy leadership in that space. This said, it's important and imperative that we get identity right, identity with security and privacy, because off of that, we can hang other use cases like proof of vaccination, for example, or proof of medical exemption from being required to get a vaccine as well. So that's part of the inclusion picture too. And so by getting the identity part right, we can ensure that those proof of vaccinations or those proof of medical exemptions don't entangle identity information that should not be presented, and identity information that really should be kept private and protected, and it's not necessarily needed to prove whether you've been vaccinated or whether you're medically exempt. So I think that's one of the most real world topics today, and the identity piece, why that's so important in the context of something like proof of vaccination.
All right, so I see that as absolutely a new use case. Let's be honest, as you say, like a lot of these use cases did need to be digital in the past, and we all had our yellow vaccination certificates or papers that we had before. But let's talk about what we absolutely needed to have, and things that could be maybe changed for us. Neil, there's quite a few people that working at Interact. I'm guessing you're not all still in the offices, so would it have made things easier for Interact? Or more secure for Interact if you guys had been able to engage with employees and authenticate them using a digital form of identity?
Yeah, I think that would be good. I mean, Interact is a relatively small company, but at the same token, being in a position to ensure that you are talking online with the right individual, the individual that you expect to be talking to, and that they can conversely authenticate you to make sure that they are giving you the information that you're privileged to have. I mean, these are use cases, everyday use cases that we just take for granted in this kind of a pandemic situation. And I also think that this is a very generic use case, but think about how the federal government or the provinces are trying to figure out if you are who you say you are in order to get benefits, for the COVID benefits as an example, or even just unemployment insurance and things like that. It's a real challenge.
Starting a new claim for EI must have been difficult. And let's be honest, a lot of people needed to apply for these new benefits. And not being 100%. Able to just go and stand in line at a service center, would have been a lot more difficult than would have been a lot easier if we could have done those things online with absolute certainty of who was on either side of the tournament. You don't want people going into on their laptops and applying for things on a website they don't know for sure it's actually the right website. And likewise, you want to make sure that the people that are doing it are really the people that say they are.
And Aaron, I'll give you one more that's very topical and personal to me. Immigration modernization. The people who are applying for immigration, or the people who are applying for citizenship. A good amount of the stall around that, rightfully so. We understand it's a pandemic, but the ability to perform the citizenship test, the ability to know that it's the right applicant on the other side, and that they have presence, and that they're taking the citizenship test. So there are so many use cases that existed pre-pandemic.
Your citizenship test got
We
delayed
had them.
because of COVID?
It's been delayed because of COVID. So I'm hopeful for September. So, but this is a real world, this is a real world use case that's here now and is affecting many people in many different walks of life.
Well, and you know what I find interesting here is that it's really easy to say, oh, the pandemic will be over in 6 months, and a delay of 6 months, not a big deal, and fine, doesn't matter. But the point is, moving forward, do we really need to have to go into a place in order to do, your immigration test? Like, why don't we do that online? Wouldn't it be better if a whole lot of these services that we currently do face-to-face and schlepping and driving and standing in line could be done online at home at the convenience of our living room at, quite frankly, whenever the heck we wanted to do it, right?
Yeah, and from our research, 80% of Canadians are happy to move what they would like to digital if they're assured that those telephone lines, those office visits will be available, and even more available to the people who really do need that mode of interaction. So we don't have to do this as a all at once flip the switch. We can move step by step with the populations that are ready and deliver even better services to the ones who want to keep that face-to-face or that phone line interaction.
All right. So what are some of that raises a point. You raised a point earlier around kind of user-centric or having self-control. There has been some movement on that around, how do we maintain control? How do we make sure that this doesn't become something that controls us? And so can you talk to us about some of the models that are evolving around that, Joni? Maybe obviously this is a big rabbit hole and you can go down for hours and hours, but just on a high level, what are some of the kind of concepts that are being talked about?
Yeah, so what we see happening in Canada and arguably around the world is that there are networks that are existing and emerging. These are information sharing networks. And so these networks can have different types they can be built on different technologies. They can have different types of governance. They can be extremely open, that one just downloads some code and you're in the network, or they can be more controlled, where you have to prove that you're following certain rules and you've been certified in certain ways to be a part of these networks. And so what we see emerging is that there will be a number of networks of this kind for information sharing, and it's going to be important to understand what interoperability looks like across these kinds of networks. And so if I'm a business or a government, it's important that I understand the rules that are being applied to these networks. Is there liability protection? What's the governance, as well as the technology components, and kind of how is the data formed? Because that's going to help those providers know where they want to offer their use cases, which kinds of those networks. For people,
just before you move on, I think so. You're talking about like standards and certification processes, right? So that we know we can trust things and we know what we're getting into when we're using them, right?
Definitely, there may be verification processes that are required, and others may not require this. And so, we can have both of those kinds of models that can exist and do exist in the same landscape. And so, it's important that decision makers kind of understand the difference between those models, and again, what the risk profiles are, and do they want to put their use case there. So that's one level of understanding. For people do need to understand, it's the difference between we'll go back to the payment metaphor. If I'm making a transaction using my payment card, or, using one of those services, I may have a better record and a better understanding of what I can do in the case of fraud. If I'm making a payment with cash, I may have no recourse at all. That cash is gone. And so that's a very good metaphor for how information sharing can be performed, and what the risk profiles might be across these different kinds of network implementations.
Right. So, I could still go and pay for a plane ticket with cash, but I actually find it really convenient to use my Interact card to do that, because then I understand I've got more receipting. I may have a kind of electronic records and things like that. And there may be kind of also protections that come with using, certain providers kind of access provision for payment, right?
That's right.
So those are the kind of considerations. And, there's a lot of different analogies within payments. But let's talk about control around my identity. And one of the things we talked about at the beginning was the fact that governments, can implement a lot of the base root credentials that we might use for giving people access to identity. But there's also, the construct of building up your own identity, right? So one of the things that people hear about is user-centric or a self-sovereign identity. Neil, what's this kind of movement around?
So it's really a movement around giving control to the end user so that they can share the data that they want to share based on their based on what they want to share with effectively. So it's really giving the control to the end user. And there's various models. There are the W3C standards that are emerging. There's the digital travel credential for international travel supported by IATA, and there's proprietary credentials that can be utilized as well. And I think the ecosystem needs to support all of these types of credentials and be interoperable. Because at Interact we don't believe that one size fits all. There needs to be availability. There needs to be optionality, and not one of these models kind of solves the entire problem. So for an ecosystem to exist, you're going to have to ingest certain protocols, and you're going to have to make available other types of protocols in order for this to all work together.
All right. So my takeaways here, as we wrap up, because we could talk about this for hours. In fact, that's a great segue. I mean, we have 7 hours of streaming times 4. We have about kind of 28 hours or so of new content coming out for the next Identity North, and then we're kind of running 3 or 4 of these a year, not to mention all of our other events that we do. So there are literally hundreds of hours of content that we're creating at Identity North to help us kind of navigate and figure out how we want to play and what we can be doing to build a digital ID ecosystem that's beneficial for all of society. And there's a lot of great topics for people to get involved in, irrespective of kind of the level of expertise. That's a great resource. There's also great resources at the DIAC, right? So Joni, you want to talk a little bit about what you guys have got cooking there, and some of the ways that that people might turn to you for other inspiration or guidance.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And in terms of inspiration, I think to build on the user-centric conversation, whenever we talk about empowering people, we also have to recognize that we are putting responsibility on them, and with great power comes great responsibility. And so for all of you who have joined Identity North, you're part of that team with that responsibility to help us work together on making this better for everyone. In terms of kind of getting jump started, we have loads of resources, as Aaron mentioned, in the DIAC website, diac.ca. If I could draw your attention to just a few pieces, you could jumpstart by looking at our 5-year strategic plan, which talks about these different network models and where things are going and what's important about interoperability and sustainability and standards and all of those topics. So I'd say review the 5-year strategy. That gives a good roadmap. Also, 2 papers that I think are really key and should be of interest is Making Sense of Networks for Identity. That's kind of a 101 primer for what identity, some of the flavors and models around identity networks. There are many, and this is a way to get you started. And then also Making Sense of Digital Wallets, which is a bit of a primer on kind of what digital wallets, how design principles for how they look. So I think those are 3 great pieces to get started, but there's certainly a wealth of papers and information that's available to you at no cost.
Awesome. And Neil, last bit to you. So, obviously you've been driving a force in payments for a long time now, both you personally and the team there at Interact. And, but, been a big focus and big shift in focus to really, following that kind of old mantra is like, there's not much point in digitizing the transaction of payments if you don't know who's on either side of the transaction. So I can really see why Interac is doubling down and sees a big role for itself kind of there. Can you talk to, I mean, and you've also made acquisitions over the last little while to kind of, also improve upon some of the technology there behind the scenes. So can you give us a bit of a, what's the 5-year plan, for Interac, and how is this going to be a big part of what you guys bring to the table?
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Aaron. At Interac, we're all about providing digital end-to-end user experiences for citizens, and we create and manage a ubiquitous network across Canada that's inclusive. And as we drive more and more user experiences that are adjacent to payments, it's incredibly important for digital ID to be the underpinning for that. So if you think about the future of the digital economy for Canada, digital ID will be the underpinning. When you think about the construct of an open banking ecosystem where you can have aggregate information from all of your financial services companies that you're dealing with, and have the concept of a dashboard, so your financial position at any given time of the day. These are all these use cases require the underpinning of digital ID. When you think of payments modernization and the ability to have real-time transaction availability, again, we need to know who's on the other side and who is transacting on our network. It's also important to point out that we're not developing a network so that we know who is actually transacting. It's all about providing the ability for anonymous capabilities, so that there's no traceability in some cases, but there is the ability to trace in the case when bad behavior happens. So it's all about that balance of privacy, security, and availability to bring these use cases to life. So that's kind of where we're looking at why we're investing in digital ID. It's important for the future of Canada, and it's important for the future of Canadians.
That's a great way to end it. And I really appreciate you guys give us the time to set up this Identity 101. This is going to be a hugely valuable resource for people coming on board. And quite frankly, I think for a lot of people that are trying to kind of think about how we need to navigate some turbulent years ahead, a lot of opportunity ahead of us. So thanks again for making the time to do this quick video. I look forward to seeing you both at Identity North, and it's going to be a great event. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say there.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much, Aaron.
Thanks, everyone. Look forward to seeing you at the next IDN event. Bye-bye.